Welcome the anointed ones. Pay close attention. The people who discover the truth first are almost never celebrated. They're doubted, laughed at, and treated like they've completely lost the plot. Then reality quietly walks in and apologizes on everyone else's behalf. There is an uncomfortable fact about human nature that history keeps proving over and over again. The greatest obstacle to truth has never been a lack of evidence. It has been people's emotional attachment to what they already believe. The human brain is wired to protect familiar ideas before it protects accurate ones. That is why the first person to recognize a hidden pattern is often dismissed long before they are understood. By the time everyone finally catches up, the damage has already been done, and suddenly the same insight that sounded crazy yesterday becomes common sense today. Now here's the funny part. People will confidently call you wrong with absolutely no research, no investigation, and no evidence. Just good old-fashioned confidence. It's almost impressive. Some folks treat guessing like it's an Olympic sport and then act shocked when reality refuses to cooperate. Reality has a wicked sense of humor because it doesn't care about popularity contests. It simply waits and then proves its point. This message is for those who have lived through that strange experience of seeing something long before everyone else did. Not because you had a crystal ball, not because you claimed to know everything, but because you noticed details that others ignored, questioned things others accepted without thinking, and refused to let public opinion become your personal compass. While everyone else was busy following the loudest voice in the room, you were quietly connecting dots that nobody even realized existed. Today's message isn't about being smarter than everyone else. It isn't about ego, pride, or proving people wrong. It's about understanding why genuine discernment often looks ridiculous before it looks brilliant. It's about discovering why independent thinking is so rare, why uncomfortable truths travel alone at first, and why those who refuse to surrender their perception to the crowd often carry the heavy burden of being misunderstood. If you've ever been mocked for something that later turned out to be true, if you've ever watched people dismiss your warnings only to experience exactly what you tried to prevent, if you've ever wondered why you seem to notice patterns that others overlook, then stay with me until the very end. Because what we're about to uncover isn't just about knowledge. It's about the hidden cost of seeing clearly in a world that has become comfortable wearing blindfolds. And once you understand this, you'll never look at being the first to know the same way again. Number 1. You recognize the pattern before the event ever happened. One of the most misunderstood abilities a person can have is the ability to recognize a pattern before it becomes a headline, a scandal, or a disaster. Most people don't make decisions by studying patterns. They make decisions based on what feels normal in the moment. If nothing looks obviously wrong, they assume everything is fine. But you learned that reality doesn't suddenly fall apart overnight. It leaves fingerprints long before it leaves evidence. This is why your observations often sounded strange to other people. You weren't reacting to one event. You were paying attention to a series of small details that on their own didn't seem important. A change in someone's behavior, a promise that quietly contradicted an earlier one, an opportunity that looked too perfect, a relationship that moved too fast, a group that suddenly became secretive. None of those things prove anything by themselves, but together they tell a story that many people never stop long enough to read. The truth is that most people don't miss danger because they lack intelligence. They miss it because their minds are trained to treat every event as separate. They see isolated moments while you naturally connect them. You notice how one decision leads to another, how one lie requires another lie to survive, and how small compromises slowly build into major consequences. That's a completely different way of looking at life. What made this difficult wasn't simply seeing the pattern. It was watching people dismiss it, because the final outcome hadn't happened yet. They wanted visible proof before they would even consider your perspective. But patterns don't begin with proof. Proof is simply the last chapter of a story that has been unfolding for a long time. By the time everyone finally agrees that something is wrong, the warning signs have already come and gone. This is why people often confuse discernment with negativity. If you're the one pointing out cracks in the foundation, while everyone else is admiring the paint on the walls, you become the uncomfortable voice in the room. People don't always reject your insight because it's inaccurate. Sometimes they reject it because it interrupts a comforting narrative they would rather keep believing. There is also a deeper reason this ability feels lonely. Human beings naturally seek agreement. We feel safer when others confirm what we think. But recognizing a pattern early often means standing without that comfort. You may find yourself questioning situations that everyone else celebrates, walking away from opportunities that others chase, or refusing to trust people who seem universally admired. From the outside, that can make you look overly cautious. From the inside, you're simply following the evidence that others haven't learned to notice yet. Time has a way of exposing the difference between a random guess and a genuine pattern. A guess depends on luck. A pattern depends on consistency. When the same behaviors keep producing the same outcomes, you're no longer making assumptions. You are recognizing a reality that repeats itself. That is why your awareness often arrives before everyone else's. You aren't predicting the future. You're paying attention to the direction things are already moving. The remarkable part is that this ability doesn't come from having all the answers. It comes from refusing to ignore the small things. Most people wait for the explosion before they admit there was a fuse. You noticed the fuse while everyone else was still enjoying the fireworks. That difference may not earn immediate applause, but it often saves you from walking blindly into situations that later leave everyone else asking the same question. How did nobody see this coming? Deep down, you already know the answer. Someone did. Number 2, your mind doesn't worship popular opinion. One of the rarest forms of freedom in this world is the ability to think without asking the crowd for permission first. That sounds simple, but it is incredibly uncommon. Most people don't realize how much of what they believe has been borrowed from family, friends, social media, television, or whatever happens to be trending at the moment. They don't question it because agreement feels comfortable. It gives them a sense of belonging. But comfort and truth have never been the same thing. You operate differently. When everyone rushes toward the same conclusion, something inside you slows down instead of speeding up. You don't reject popular opinion just to be different, but you also refuse to accept it just because millions of people agree. You understand that 1,000 confident voices can still be wrong if they are all repeating the same unchecked idea. That mindset makes people uncomfortable because independent thinkers cannot be easily controlled. If your opinions are built on careful observation instead of social pressure, it becomes difficult for fear, hype, or emotional manipulation to move you. You become less predictable, and that unsettles people who expect everyone to follow the same script. The strange thing is that many people confuse independent thinking with rebellion. They assume that if you don't agree with the majority, you must be trying to cause trouble. In reality, you are simply asking questions that others are afraid to ask. You're willing to examine both sides before making up your mind. You'd rather be temporarily unpopular than permanently misled. This is why you often arrive at conclusions long before everyone else. While others are busy repeating headlines, rumors, or opinions they picked up from someone else, you're quietly examining the foundation beneath those claims. You want to know who benefits, what evidence exists, what doesn't add up, and why certain stories spread so quickly while others disappear without explanation. That habit protects you from being swept away by every wave of public emotion. History has shown this countless times. The majority has often defended ideas that later proved to be deeply flawed. At different moments, entire societies have celebrated things that future generations looked back on with disbelief. The crowd isn't always foolish, but neither is it automatically wise. Numbers can create confidence, but they cannot create truth. There is also a personal cost to thinking this way. Independent minds are often misunderstood because they don't provide the instant agreement people expect. Some will call you stubborn. Others will say you overthink everything. A few may even accuse you of being negative simply because you refuse to accept easy answers. But none of those labels change reality. Thinking carefully is not a weakness. It is a form of discipline. The greatest advantage of refusing to worship popular opinion is that your beliefs become your own. They are not built on fear of rejection or the desire to fit in. They are built on observation, reflection, and the courage to stand alone when necessary. That doesn't mean you'll be right every time. No one is. But it does mean your mind remains free enough to recognize truth when it appears, even if it arrives wearing clothes that nobody else is willing to accept. That is why you often know first, not because you're following a different crowd, but because you're following the evidence wherever it leads. Number 3, you notice what everyone else filters out. There is a huge difference between looking and truly noticing. Most people believe they pay attention, but in reality they only pay attention to what confirms what they already expect to see. The human mind is constantly filtering information. It ignores details that seem unimportant, dismisses things that feel inconvenient, and quietly pushes aside anything that challenges a comfortable belief. That is why two people can witness the exact same situation and walk away with completely different understandings of what actually happened. You have learned to notice what slips through everyone else's mental filter. It isn't because you possess some mysterious gift. It's because you don't stop at the surface. While others become distracted by appearances, personalities, titles, or polished words, your attention naturally moves toward the small details that don't quite fit. You notice when someone's actions slowly drift away from their promises. You notice when enthusiasm suddenly feels forced, when kindness appears only in public, or when a person's story changes ever so slightly each time they tell it. Most people brush those things aside. You quietly file them away. One inconsistency may mean nothing. Two may be a coincidence. But when those small cracks keep appearing, they stop being random. They become a pattern. That is where your awareness begins to separate itself from the crowd. You don't build your conclusions from one dramatic moment. You build them from dozens of quiet moments that most people never even register. This is why you are rarely shocked when the truth finally comes out. Other people react with disbelief because they only remember the polished image they were shown. You remember the tiny warning signs that never made sense, the uncomfortable pauses, the strange timing, the promises that were never fulfilled, the subtle shift in energy when certain topics came up. Those pieces stayed with you even when everyone else forgot them. One of the greatest mistakes people make is believing that deception always looks obvious. It doesn't. Real deception often hides inside ordinary behavior. It survives because each individual detail seems too small to matter. People wait for one giant piece of evidence while ignoring the hundreds of tiny clues that quietly point in the same direction. By the time the undeniable proof arrives, they call it unexpected. It wasn't unexpected. It was simply unnoticed. This ability can sometimes make you feel isolated because people often misunderstand your conclusions. They think you're jumping to assumptions when in reality, You've been collecting observations for much longer than they realize. They only see your conclusion. They don't see the months or even years of careful attention that led you there. There is also a discipline behind this kind of awareness. It requires patience. It requires resisting the urge to judge too quickly, while also refusing to ignore what keeps repeating itself. You don't become wise by reacting to every little thing. You become wise by recognizing which little things refuse to go away. Repetition has a language of its own, and you have learned to listen. That is why you often know before everyone else. While others are waiting for the loud announcement, you're already hearing the quiet whispers. The truth rarely bursts through the front door without warning. More often it slips in unnoticed, leaving tiny footprints along the way. Most people never see them. You do, and those small footprints eventually lead you to a reality that everyone else only recognizes after it has become impossible to ignore. Number 4. People mock what forces them to rethink their entire reality. One of the hardest truths to accept is that people do not always reject an idea because it is false. Many times they reject it because accepting it would completely rearrange the way they see the world. That kind of change is uncomfortable. It demands humility. It requires admitting that something they defended for years may have been incomplete or even wrong. For many people, protecting their current beliefs feels easier than rebuilding them from the ground up. That is why laughter is often used as a shield. Instead of honestly examining an uncomfortable truth, people make jokes, roll their eyes, or dismiss it without giving it serious thought. Mockery becomes a shortcut. It allows them to avoid the difficult work of questioning themselves. If they can make the messenger look foolish, they never have to wrestle with the message itself. This happens more often than most people realize. The moment an idea challenges someone's identity, traditions, reputation, or long-held assumptions, the conversation stops being about evidence. It becomes about self-protection. The mind quietly asks, if this is true, what else have I been wrong about? That question is heavier than many people are willing to carry. You may have experienced this firsthand. You shared an observation, raised a concern, or pointed out something that didn't add up, only to be met with sarcasm instead of curiosity. It wasn't necessarily because your words lacked substance. It was because your words touched something people weren't emotionally prepared to examine. They heard a threat where you intended insight. The interesting part is that people rarely admit this. They usually believe they are rejecting your conclusion when, in reality, they are protecting their comfort. Comfort has a powerful influence over human behavior. Once people become emotionally invested in a certain version of reality, they start defending it, even when small cracks begin to appear. They would rather explain away those cracks than face the possibility that the entire foundation needs to be rebuilt. History is full of moments like this. New discoveries, fresh perspectives, and uncomfortable truths have often been laughed at before they were accepted. Not because they lacked merit, but because they arrived too early for minds that were still attached to yesterday's certainty. Time has a way of softening resistance. What sounded outrageous in one season can become obvious in another. This is why you should never measure the value of an insight by the reaction it receives. Some of the most important truths begin their journey in rooms filled with doubt. Immediate applause is not always a sign that an idea is profound. In fact, ideas that challenge deeply held assumptions often face the strongest resistance first. There is also a lesson in this for you. Don't become discouraged when people dismiss what you have carefully observed. Their reaction may reveal more about the walls they have built around their own thinking than about the strength of your reasoning. Stay humble, remain open to correction, and continue seeking truth rather than validation. In the end, reality has a quiet way of settling every argument. Opinions can be loud, emotions can be persuasive, and mockery can be relentless, but none of them have the power to rewrite what is true. Eventually, the truth no longer asks for permission to be believed. It simply stands there, undeniable, leaving those who once laughed to wonder why they never saw it sooner. Number 5. You saw the ending. While everyone was still admiring the beginning. One of the greatest differences between wisdom and excitement is that excitement focuses on what something looks like today, while wisdom quietly asks where it is leading tomorrow. Most people are captivated by impressive beginnings. They are drawn to charisma, big promises, fast success, and polished appearances. They become so fascinated by what is happening in the moment that they rarely stop to ask what kind of future is slowly being built underneath it all. You think differently. Your attention naturally moves beyond the first impression. You don't just listen to what people say, you watch what they repeatedly do. You don't judge opportunities by how exciting they seem on the first day. You pay attention to whether they have a solid foundation. You understand that every choice carries a direction, and every direction eventually reaches a destination. That simple habit allows you to notice endings while everyone else is still celebrating beginnings. This is why you are often less impressed by things that instantly amaze everyone else. You've learned that a spectacular start can hide a weak structure. A charming personality can conceal poor character. A rapid rise can be built on unstable ground. You have seen enough to know that appearances have a way of demanding attention, while hidden flaws quietly prepare the future. Many people misunderstand this ability. They assume you're pessimistic because you ask difficult questions before everyone else does. But you're not looking for reasons to doubt. You're looking for reasons to understand. There is a huge difference. Anyone can be impressed by what shines. It takes discernment to examine what supports the shine. This is also why disappointment surprises you less often than it surprises others. When situations eventually fall apart, people describe the outcome as sudden or unexpected. They say they never saw it coming. But you remember the overlooked warning signs that were present from the very beginning. The little compromises that everyone excused. The promises that never matched the actions. The decisions that seemed harmless at first but quietly pointed in the wrong direction. Those small details were already telling the story of how everything would unfold. One of life's deepest lessons is that endings are rarely created at the end. They are usually formed in the beginning, hidden inside habits, attitudes, and choices that seem too small to matter. Every strong tree begins as a healthy seed, and every weak structure begins with a flawed foundation. Time simply reveals what was already developing beneath the surface. That is why you don't rush to celebrate too early or panic too quickly. You understand that time exposes what excitement often hides. While others become consumed by the first chapter, you're paying attention to the entire story. You're asking whether today's decisions will still make sense years from now, whether today's character can withstand tomorrow's pressure, and whether today's path actually leads where people think it does. This way of seeing can feel lonely because the crowd usually celebrates what is immediate. Few people have the patience to think beyond the present moment. But wisdom has always required a longer view. It recognizes that every beginning contains clues about its ending for those willing to look closely enough. And that is why you often know what is coming before anyone else does, not because you can predict the future, but because you understand that the future is already taking shape in the choices being made today. Number 6. Your discernment was built by surviving repeated deception. There are people who become wiser because someone patiently taught them life's lessons. Then there are people who become wiser because life gave them no other choice. Your discernment didn't appear overnight, and it certainly didn't come from reading a few inspiring words. It was shaped in moments when trust was broken, when promises disappeared, when people smiled to your face but carried different intentions behind your back. Every painful experience became a lesson that sharpened your ability to see beneath the surface. At first, those experiences probably felt unfair. You questioned why you kept encountering the same kinds of disappointments, while others seemed to move through life untouched. But looking back, you begin to understand something remarkable. Each deception left behind more than pain. It left behind knowledge. You started recognizing behaviors that once slipped past you. You noticed the difference between sincere words and carefully rehearsed ones. You learned that consistency speaks louder than charm, and that character reveals itself over time, not in impressive first impressions. One of the biggest changes was that you stopped listening only to what people said. Instead, you began paying attention to what they repeatedly did. Anyone can make beautiful promises when nothing is being tested. Real character appears when keeping those promises becomes inconvenient. That lesson alone has protected you from walking into situations that once would have fooled you. People who have never been deeply deceived often assume everyone deserves immediate trust. They believe good intentions are enough to judge a person's heart. You know better, not because you've become cynical, but because you've become observant. There is a difference. Cynicism assumes everyone is dishonest. Discernment simply waits for actions to confirm words before giving complete confidence. The interesting part is that those painful seasons changed the questions you ask. Instead of wondering, do they sound convincing? You quietly ask, do their actions remain consistent when nobody is watching? That single shift changes everything. It allows you to see what excitement and emotion often hide. Ironically, many people misunderstand your caution. They think you've become distant, difficult to impress, or too careful. What they don't see is the price you paid to gain that wisdom. They weren't there when trust was abused, or when your kindness was taken for granted. They didn't experience the moments that forced you to develop stronger boundaries. From the outside, your caution looks unnecessary. From the inside, it is the result of lessons you earned the hard way. The beautiful thing about true discernment is that it doesn't leave you trapped in bitterness. It leaves you equipped. You no longer need to fear deception the way you once did because your eyes have been trained to notice what they missed before. Pain has become a teacher instead of a prison. Number 7. Truth usually arrives. Looking completely unreasonable. One of the greatest mistakes people make is believing that truth always arrives dressed in confidence, popularity, and immediate acceptance. It rarely does. More often than not, truth walks into the room looking awkward, inconvenient, and completely out of place. It interrupts comfortable conversations, challenges familiar beliefs, and asks questions that nobody wants to answer. That is exactly why so many people reject it before they ever take the time to understand it. Human beings have a natural tendency to trust what feels familiar. If an idea fits neatly with what they already believe, they welcome it without much resistance. But when something forces them to rethink years of assumptions, their first reaction is often disbelief. It is easier to label an idea as ridiculous than to admit that your understanding may have been incomplete all along. This is why some of the most important truths in life are ignored at first. They don't fail because they lack evidence. They fail because they arrive before people are emotionally prepared to receive them. Timing matters more than most realize. The same message that gets laughed at today may receive applause a few years later, even if not a single word has changed. What changed wasn't the truth. What changed was people's willingness to face it. You have probably experienced this yourself. You noticed something that didn't seem right. You questioned a popular opinion or pointed out a flaw that others overlooked. Instead of considering what you said, people dismissed it almost instantly, not because they had carefully examined your reasoning, but because your conclusions sounded too different from what everyone else believed. There is something fascinating about the way people measure credibility. Many assume that if an idea is unpopular, it must be weak, but popularity has never been a reliable test of truth. Large groups of people can repeat the same mistake for years, simply because each person assumes someone else has already done the thinking. Confidence spreads quickly through a crowd, even when certainty has very little foundation. Another reason truth often sounds unreasonable is because it usually begins with small observations instead of dramatic proof. It starts with someone noticing tiny inconsistencies, asking difficult questions, or refusing to ignore details that others dismiss. At first, those observations seem insignificant. Then more pieces begin to fit together. Eventually, what once looked impossible becomes undeniable. The truth didn't suddenly appear. It was quietly revealing itself all along. This is where patience becomes so important. If you abandon every idea simply because it isn't immediately accepted, you will spend your life chasing approval instead of understanding. Some insights need time. Some realities cannot be rushed. They unfold gradually, allowing those who pay close attention to recognize them long before they become obvious to everyone else. That doesn't mean every unusual idea is true. Discernment still matters. Evidence still matters. Humility still matters. But it does mean you should never reject something simply because it challenges what you've always believed. The greatest discoveries, the deepest personal growth, and the most life-changing realizations often begin as thoughts that seem impossible at first glance. Number 8. Your spirit pays attention to what logic alone cannot explain. There are moments in life when facts tell only part of the story. Logic is incredibly valuable. It helps you solve problems, make wise decisions, and separate truth from confusion. But there are experiences that don't fit neatly into a spreadsheet or a perfect explanation. Sometimes, long before your mind can explain why something feels wrong or right, your spirit has already noticed what your eyes have not yet fully understood. This doesn't mean you ignore reason or believe every strange feeling that comes along. Real discernment is not impulsive, and it is not driven by fear. Instead, it comes from learning to pay attention to those quiet inner nudges that refuse to disappear. They are not loud or dramatic. They don't shout over every decision. They simply remain present, gently asking you to look a little deeper when something doesn't quite make sense. You may have experienced times when everything looked perfect on the outside, yet something inside you refused to settle. Everyone else celebrated the opportunity, praised the person, or rushed toward the situation. But you couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. At first, you may have questioned yourself. You wondered if you were overthinking or being too cautious. Then, weeks or months later, hidden truths came to light, and suddenly that quiet inner warning made perfect sense. The opposite can also happen. There are times when a path looks uncertain, risky, or even unpopular, yet deep inside you carry an unusual sense of peace. Other people may not understand why you're so calm, but your confidence isn't coming from appearances. It's coming from a deeper conviction that cannot be easily explained. That kind of peace often becomes more valuable than endless opinions from people who can only judge what they see on the surface. Many people ignore these moments because they have trained themselves to trust only what can be immediately measured. If they cannot explain something in 5 minutes, they dismiss it. But life has a way of reminding us that not everything important announces itself with obvious evidence. Some realities reveal themselves quietly, asking us to remain patient enough to notice. This kind of awareness also requires humility. Every inner impression should be tested with wisdom, good judgment, and consistent evidence. Discernment grows stronger when your spirit and your reasoning work together instead of competing with each other. One without the other can easily lead you in the wrong direction, but when they move in harmony, they create a clarity that is difficult to ignore. People may not always understand why you hesitate when they rush or why you remain peaceful when they panic. That's because they are only evaluating what is visible. You have learned to pay attention to what is happening beneath the surface. You understand that appearances can be convincing while reality quietly tells a different story. That is one of the reasons you often recognize the truth before everyone else does. You don't depend only on what is loud, popular, or immediately obvious. You listen carefully to what remains steady even when the noise fades away. While others wait for undeniable proof before taking notice, you have learned that some of life's most important warnings and some of its greatest confirmations first arrive as a quiet conviction that refuses to let go. That quiet awareness has guided you more times than you can count, and with time, you have learned that it is rarely speaking without a reason. Number 9, you were willing to lose approval in exchange for accuracy. One of the quietest battles a person can fight is the battle between being accepted and being honest. Most people never realize how much of their thinking is shaped by the desire to fit in. They soften their opinions, stay silent when something feels wrong, and agree with ideas they secretly question, not because they believe them, but because they fear the consequences of standing alone. Approval becomes so valuable that truth slowly becomes negotiable. You made a different choice. At some point, you realized that temporary acceptance is a poor trade if it requires sacrificing what you genuinely know to be true. That decision was not easy. It came with uncomfortable conversations, misunderstood intentions, and moments when people walked away because you refused to repeat what everyone else wanted to hear. But something inside you understood that peace built on pretending is never real peace at all. The interesting thing about approval is that it can disappear overnight. The same people applauding you today may criticize you tomorrow if public opinion changes. If your identity depends on their approval, you will spend your life constantly adjusting yourself to match the latest trend. You become like a leaf blown by every changing wind, never standing firmly for anything because you're always afraid of losing someone's applause. Accuracy demands something very different. It asks you to be patient enough to gather facts before forming conclusions. It asks you to admit when you're wrong and remain steady when you're right, even if nobody agrees with you at first. That kind of integrity cannot be built on popularity. It is built through discipline, humility, and the courage to let reality, not public opinion, shape your thinking. Many people mistake this for stubbornness. They assume that because you don't immediately change your position, you're unwilling to listen. In truth, you are listening very carefully. You're simply listening to evidence more than emotion, to consistency more than excitement, and to reality more than reputation. If better evidence appears, you're willing to adjust. But you refuse to change your convictions just because the crowd becomes louder. There is a price for living this way. You won't always be the most popular person in the room. Some people will misunderstand your motives. Others may call you difficult because you ask questions they would rather avoid. But over time, something remarkable begins to happen. People start noticing that your conclusions are not driven by trends or pressure. They begin to trust your judgment because they know it isn't for sale. The greatest reward is not proving other people wrong. It is protecting your own conscience. There is a unique kind of freedom that comes from knowing you didn't betray your understanding just to gain temporary approval. You can sleep peacefully because your decisions were guided by conviction instead of fear. Number 10. People didn't reject your message. They rejected your timing. One of the most frustrating experiences in life is knowing that what you said was true, yet watching people dismiss it simply because they weren't ready to hear it. The strange part is that many ideas are not rejected because they lack value. They are rejected because they arrive before people have reached the point where they are willing to listen. Timing has a powerful influence on how truth is received. Think about how often people say, "Now I finally understand what you meant." The message didn't suddenly become wiser. The words didn't magically change. What changed was their perspective. Life gave them experiences they didn't have before, and those experiences opened a door that had been firmly closed. Suddenly, the same truth they once ignored became impossible to overlook. This is why being early can sometimes feel exactly like being wrong. When everyone around you believes one thing and you quietly see another, you become the odd one out. People may question your judgment, your motives, or even your character. They assume that because they cannot see what you see today, it must not exist. But reality doesn't operate according to public readiness. Truth doesn't wait until it has enough supporters before becoming true. There is another reason timing matters so much. People usually learn through experience, not just information. You can warn someone about a dangerous path, explain every consequence, and offer every reason imaginable. But if they are emotionally attached to that path, they often won't understand until they experience it themselves. Experience has a way of teaching lessons that words alone cannot. That doesn't mean your message was wasted. Sometimes your words quietly remain in someone's mind long after the conversation has ended. Months later, when events begin to unfold, they remember what you said. At first, they may have laughed, argued, or ignored you, but reality has a remarkable way of bringing forgotten conversations back into focus. What once sounded strange suddenly becomes clear because life has provided the missing context. This teaches an important lesson about patience. If you measure the value of what you know by how quickly people accept it, you'll become discouraged. Some truths need time to grow. Just as a seed buried in the ground appears invisible before it breaks through the surface, genuine insight often develops quietly before others recognize its value. Immediate acceptance is not the only measure of significance. It also reminds you to remain humble. Being ahead of the moment doesn't make you superior to anyone else. It simply means your understanding arrived before theirs did. There may be areas where someone else sees clearly while you are still learning. Wisdom never turns timing into arrogance. Instead, it turns it into compassion. So don't be discouraged if people fail to understand you right away. Continue speaking with honesty. Continue observing carefully, and continue letting truth guide your words. You cannot force someone to be ready before they are ready. All you can do is remain faithful to what you know and trust that reality will eventually speak for itself. Number 11, your greatest evidence was the peace you couldn't explain. There is a kind of confidence that makes a lot of noise. It argues with everyone, demands attention, and constantly tries to prove itself. Then there is another kind of confidence that barely says anything at all. It doesn't need endless debates because it isn't trying to win approval. It carries a quiet peace that remains steady, even when everything around it becomes uncertain. That kind of peace is often misunderstood because people expect certainty to look loud. In reality, some of the strongest convictions are also the calmest. You may have noticed this in your own life. There were moments when everyone around you was anxious, excited, or rushing toward the same conclusion, yet something inside you remained still. You couldn't fully explain it. You didn't have every answer, and you certainly couldn't predict every detail. But deep within you, there was an unshakable sense that you either needed to move forward or walk away. That quiet certainty didn't come from pressure or emotion. It came from a place that stayed calm, while everything else was unsettled. Most people struggle to understand this because they have been taught to trust whatever is loudest. They assume that the strongest opinion wins, that the busiest room contains the greatest wisdom, or that confidence must always be dramatic. But noise and certainty are not the same thing. A person can speak with absolute confidence and still be completely mistaken. Another can barely raise their voice and yet understand exactly what is happening. That inner peace became one of your greatest forms of evidence because it wasn't easily shaken by changing opinions. While others constantly looked around to see what everyone else believed, you quietly examined what remained true after the excitement faded away. You discovered that panic spreads quickly, but genuine peace does not depend on circumstances. It remains steady because it is rooted deeper than temporary emotions. This doesn't mean you never experience doubt. Every thoughtful person wrestles with uncertainty from time to time. The difference is that your deepest decisions were not controlled by fear. You learned to separate temporary emotions from lasting conviction. You stopped mistaking nervousness for danger and excitement for wisdom. Instead, you paid attention to what continued to feel right long after the emotional moment had passed. There is also something powerful about refusing to chase constant reassurance. Many people cannot make a decision until they have collected enough opinions to feel safe. They keep asking everyone else what they should think, hoping someone will remove the responsibility of choosing. But you discovered that some decisions cannot be made by committee. At some point, you have to trust what you have carefully observed and move forward with integrity, even if nobody else understands. Ironically, that quiet peace often confused people more than any argument could. They expected you to become defensive, to panic under pressure, or to abandon your position when others disagreed. Instead, they found someone who remained remarkably steady. Not because you were stubborn, but because your confidence wasn't built on applause. It was built on something far more durable. Number 12. The world rewards confidence. More quickly than accuracy. One of the most overlooked truths about human nature is that people are naturally drawn to confidence. Someone who speaks boldly, never hesitates, and sounds absolutely certain can easily capture a room, even when their facts are shaky. Meanwhile, the person who has carefully studied the situation, weighed the evidence, and speaks with humility is often ignored because they don't sound as dramatic. It is a strange reality, but confidence frequently gets attention long before accuracy earns respect. That explains why so many people mistake certainty for wisdom. They assume that if someone speaks loudly enough or with enough passion, they must know what they are talking about. But volume has never been proof. Neither has charisma. A person can deliver a completely wrong message with incredible confidence, and many will believe it simply because it feels convincing. You notice this long before others did. You realize that the people who are quickest to answer are not always the ones who understand the situation best. In fact, those who truly know something often recognize how much there is still to learn. They don't rush to make absolute claims because they understand that truth deserves careful attention, not reckless certainty. This is one reason you often felt out of place. While others were making bold declarations based on limited information, you were still observing, connecting details, and making sure your conclusion could stand the test of time. Some mistook your patience for hesitation. Others assumed your careful thinking meant you lacked confidence. They couldn't see that you weren't afraid to speak. You were simply unwilling to speak carelessly. The problem with chasing confidence over accuracy is that reality eventually demands proof. Exciting speeches can inspire people for a while. Strong personalities can attract followers. Popular opinions can dominate conversations. But sooner or later, results begin to tell the real story. Facts have a stubborn way of surviving after excitement fades. This is why many people who once seemed unstoppable suddenly lose credibility. Their confidence carried them for a season, but confidence without substance cannot support itself forever. When pressure increases, appearances begin to crack, and what was hidden underneath becomes impossible to ignore. On the other hand, accurate people often take longer to be recognized. They spend more time listening than speaking. They ask questions before making claims. They care more about getting it right than getting applause. That approach may not attract immediate attention, but it builds something far more valuable: lasting trust. You have probably experienced moments when people overlooked your perspective at first, only to return later and admit that you were right. Not because you shouted the loudest, but because your conclusions were built on careful observation rather than excitement. While others rushed to impress, you chose to understand. The lesson is simple but powerful. Never measure your value by how quickly people notice you. Fast recognition and lasting credibility are not the same thing. One is built on perception, the other is built on truth. Number 13. Your biggest advantage is that you don't need to be first, only correct. There's a strange pressure in today's world to be first at everything. People race to break the news first, post their opinions first, react first, and claim they knew something before anyone else. Speed has become a symbol of intelligence, even though the two are not the same. Being first may attract attention, but attention is not the same as truth. A person can arrive first and still end up in the wrong place. You have learned something far more valuable. You understand that accuracy has a longer life than excitement. You don't feel the need to rush into every conversation with an instant answer. You are comfortable taking the time to observe, think, and examine what is really happening before reaching a conclusion. While others are sprinting toward quick recognition, you are quietly building something much harder to achieve: credibility. That patience is often misunderstood. Some people assume you are slow to respond because you lack confidence. Others think you are hesitant because you don't know enough. What they fail to see is that wisdom is rarely in a hurry. It understands that a rushed conclusion can create years of unnecessary confusion. Taking time to understand something completely is not weakness. It is discipline. One of the greatest traps people fall into is confusing urgency with importance. Just because everyone is demanding an immediate opinion doesn't mean an immediate opinion is the right one. There is tremendous strength in saying, "I need more information before I decide." That kind of honesty protects you from becoming another voice, spreading ideas that haven't been carefully tested. Ironically, many of the people who rush to be first spend even more time trying to explain why they were wrong. They make bold claims before they have enough evidence, and later they are forced to change their story. Their desire to be noticed becomes more important than their desire to be accurate. Over time, people begin to recognize the difference. A reputation built on speed is fragile. A reputation built on careful judgment grows stronger with every passing year. You have discovered that truth doesn't panic. It doesn't demand that you reach a conclusion before the facts are ready. It can afford to wait because reality is not threatened by time. Falsehood often depends on urgency because it hopes people will react before they have a chance to think clearly. This is why your words carry weight when they finally come. People may not always appreciate your silence in the beginning, but they remember your consistency in the end. You speak after you have observed, reflected, and connected the pieces, instead of reacting to every rumor or emotional wave. That habit makes your insight dependable. The greatest advantage you possess isn't that you always know first. It's that when you do speak, your words are rooted in careful thought rather than impulse. You value understanding more than applause, and truth more than recognition. That choice may not make you the fastest voice in the room, but it often makes you the one people return to when the noise has faded, and they finally need someone they can trust. Number 14. Your awareness isn't a gift of intelligence alone. It's the result of what you've refused to compromise. People often assume that those who see the truth first were simply born smarter than everyone else. They imagine that awareness is something you either have or you don't. But that explanation misses something much deeper. Intelligence can help you solve problems, but it cannot guarantee clear vision. Some of the smartest people in the world have convinced themselves of things that were completely false because they allowed comfort, pride, or personal gain to cloud their judgment. What truly sharpens a person's awareness is not intelligence alone. It is integrity. It is the daily decision to refuse shortcuts, even when shortcuts are easier. It is choosing honesty when dishonesty would be more rewarding. It is refusing to ignore uncomfortable facts simply because they interfere with a preferred outcome. Every time you choose truth over convenience, something inside you becomes a little clearer. Most people don't lose their ability to recognize reality all at once. It happens gradually. One small compromise leads to another. A person ignores one obvious warning because it benefits them. Then they overlook another because admitting it would be embarrassing. Before long, they are no longer following the evidence. They are following whatever protects their comfort. Their judgment slowly becomes shaped by what they want to be true instead of what actually is. You refused to make that trade. It wasn't always easy. There were moments when accepting an easy lie would have made your life simpler. Going along with the crowd would have earned approval. Staying silent would have avoided conflict. But something inside you kept pulling you back toward honesty, even when honesty came with a cost. That is why your perspective often feels different. You have trained yourself to face uncomfortable realities instead of running from them. You don't automatically dismiss information because it challenges your beliefs. At the same time, you don't blindly accept every new idea just because it sounds exciting. You allow truth to challenge you, correct you, and sometimes even humble you. That willingness to be corrected is one of the strongest signs of genuine wisdom. There is also a quiet discipline behind this way of living. You are constantly asking yourself difficult questions. Am I seeing this clearly? Am I allowing my emotions to distort the facts? Am I defending what is true, or am I defending my pride? Those questions keep your mind honest. They prevent certainty from turning into arrogance. Ironically, people may never notice this inner work. They only see the result. They see someone who often recognizes patterns before others do, someone who remains steady when confusion spreads, and someone who is difficult to manipulate with fear or popular opinion. What they don't see are the countless private decisions that built that clarity over time. Your awareness is not the product of perfection. It is the product of repeatedly choosing principle over pressure, honesty over convenience, and reality over illusion. Every one of those choices has strengthened your ability to see beyond appearances. That is why you often know before everyone else, not because you possess secret knowledge, but because you have protected the one thing many people quietly sacrifice, the courage to let truth lead, even when it asks you to walk a path that few are willing to take. In the end, that courage becomes your greatest advantage, because a mind that refuses to compromise with deception will eventually recognize what others overlook until it is far too late. We've covered a lot in this message, but if there's one truth you should carry with you after today, it's this. Knowing first isn't about being lucky, being louder than everyone else, or believing you're better than anyone else. More often than not, it's the result of paying attention when everyone else is distracted, asking questions when everyone else is accepting easy answers, and having the courage to remain faithful to what you've carefully observed, even when nobody around you agrees. The world has always celebrated quick reactions, loud opinions, and popular ideas. But history, and life itself, keep teaching the same lesson. Crowds can be convinced, trends can change, opinions can rise and fall overnight. Reality doesn't. The truth doesn't become true because people applaud it, and it doesn't become false because people reject it. It simply waits until time reveals what was there all along. If this message resonates with you, don't let it feed pride. Let it build responsibility. There is a difference. Seeing clearly isn't a license to look down on others. It's a reminder to stay humble, to keep learning, and to remain teachable. The moment you believe you know everything is often the moment you stop noticing what you still need to learn. True discernment is never arrogant. It is patient, honest, and willing to be corrected whenever the evidence demands it. Never forget that some of the greatest mistakes in history happened because people blindly followed what everyone else believed. At the same time, some of the greatest breakthroughs happened because a few ordinary people refused to ignore what everyone else overlooked. The difference was never simply intelligence. It was the willingness to seek truth even when truth was uncomfortable. So continue paying attention. Continue questioning what doesn't make sense. Continue valuing character over appearance, consistency over empty promises, wisdom over popularity, and truth over temporary approval. Don't allow the pressure to fit in to silence the clarity you've worked so hard to develop. Protect your integrity, because once integrity is compromised, discernment slowly begins to fade. But when you remain committed to honesty, your vision becomes sharper with every lesson life teaches you. And remember this above all else: being misunderstood for a season is far better than understanding too late. Many people only recognize the warning signs after the damage has already been done. If you've learned to recognize the pattern before the outcome, value that gift. Use it wisely. Use it with humility. Use it to make better decisions, protect your peace, and help others whenever they're ready to listen. Thank you for spending this time with me. If this message spoke to your heart, challenged your thinking, or gave you even one powerful aha moment, don't let it end here. Subscribe to the Lord's Chosen and become part of a community that isn't afraid to think deeply, seek wisdom, and pursue truth beyond appearances. Give this video a thumbs up to help it reach more people who need this message. Share it with someone who has always sensed there was more beneath the surface, but couldn't quite put it into words. And I'd really love to hear from you in the comments. Have you ever recognized a pattern long before everyone else did? Were you dismissed at first, only for time to prove your observations right? Share your experience below. Your story might encourage someone else who is walking through that same lonely season of being misunderstood. Until next time, keep your mind sharp, your heart humble, and your spirit grounded in truth. Because in a world overflowing with noise, the people who quietly pursue truth will always see what the crowd eventually discovers. Stay blessed, stay discerning, and I'll see you in the next video. God bless you.